Uh, we're working out our Wi-Fi. Let me introduce the event tonight's event for everyone who is filing into our webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual event series. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator, and I'm thrilled to be hosting the launch for Gatecrasher by Ben Widdicombe. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function on your screen, or else the chat, and Ben will take them at the end. You can also raise your hand to use the audio, and we will use that also at the end during the Q&A. You can buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. We have the link in the chat and also on the event page. And we will be reposting again. Ben will be in conversation with Katie Rosman, and I'll introduce them now. Katie Rosman is a writer and reporter for the New York Times, previously at the Wall Street Journal, and author of If You Knew Susie. Ben Widdicombe is the editor-in-chief of Avenue Magazine, a specialist in the intersection of high culture and pop culture. He is the only journalist who has worked for the New York Times, TMZ, and Page Six. Hand it over now.
That is a very auspicious resume, bona fides, Ben. We are lucky to be in the presence of such a man with such widespread talent. So thank you so much for talking with me and all of us tonight. I feel like we can all use like a little gossip. Just there's so much heavy duty, really upsetting, serious news, and gossip plays a role in serious news, but it's its own thing too, and it just is so much more fun. And I think it'll be rollicking and enjoyable tonight. So thank you. So I thought we should start by maybe you'd like to tell our friends who have joined us here today about our initial collaboration, as it were.
Sure. Well, I would say, Katie, it wasn't so much collaboration as sabotage on your part. So for just shy of 2 years, I wrote a weekly social column in the style section where you write every week. And it was called No Regrets. And of course, one of the biggest annual parties that one could cover in that role was the annual Vanity Fair Oscars party out in LA. And it was my first time going. I was super excited. In all my years as a gossip columnist, I'd never been inside. So that was my big year, and this was 2018. And I was going to go out and cover 2 parties for the Oscars. It was going to be Vanity Fair and also the Governor's Ball, which is the big official after party that the Oscars throws themselves, where all the winners go and get their statues engraved. And I was literally in the air when your story, Brooks Barnes, who's based in LA, broke in the style section about how the Vanity Fair party is totally over and it's not good anymore. And literally, if you have enough points with your Marriott Rewards card, you can go. And
that's not quite what I said, but yes, go on.
It's a perk. And then I went to pick up my baggage at baggage claim, and I checked my phone, and I had been disinvited in the air based on your story. So I ended up having the Governor's Ball that year.
Well, I think Brooks and I felt terrible about that, and we never obviously intended to have you thrown out before, as I think you said in Page 6, your own terrible behavior could result in the same. And we didn't say that the Vanity Fair party was terrible. We said that it had become more corporate, and I think that was true, though I think it has been restored to grandeur by Radhika Jones. So, but it was quite a thing, and pretty shocking to me when we heard that you got thrown out. But that's part probably of your job. I mean, have you been thrown out of places before? I mean, do you only show up where you're invited, or is the role sometimes to just crash, as the title of your memoir indicates?
So occasionally, I think it does behoove you as a reporter to crash. In my 2 years doing the column for the Times, I think I crashed one party that I was covering, and that was the CBS holiday party during a time when Les Moonves was on the hot seat, and it was just the first months of the Me Too movement. And they would normally have the CBS holiday party in the executive offices in their building. And as one of their staff told me off the record, that is now a crime scene based on the allegations against Les Moonves. They had it at a big restaurant here in the city, 8½. And my editor, Denny Lee, wanted me to cover that, but I wasn't invited, so I did crash that. But that was the only time for the Times. The book.
How did you get in? I mean, do you just walk in and hope they don't notice, or do you sweet talk, or what do you do?
You up the accent. That still works sometimes.
Smart.
But also, I think the door staff wasn't particularly well trained. And I dropped the New York Times in, which was true. And so they kind of, the velvet rope parted. But, in the book, it's all about moving to New York City in 1998 with my partner, Horatio Silver, and we wrote a fashion gossip column on the internet, the first ever online fashion gossip column. And we were total nobodies. I was literally selling hot dogs on the street during the day as my job. And we were crashing these fashion parties at night, and we started writing this column. And much to my own surprise, I became known as a gossip columnist, which was had never been a career ambition, but this column kind of took off. And so from there, I went to page 6 of the Daily News, and ultimately to my own column called Gatecrasher in the News, and thence to TMZ before going to the Times in 2010.
Wow. Well, and I made a comment at the top of the conversation that gossip, is a respite from hard news, and that is often true. But we're seeing an intersection much more, and we have a pop culture figure as president to sort of prove the point. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Kanye West, who really, if you talk about the intersection of gossip and news or celebrity and politics, he's very much at the epicenter right now. So tell us, what do you make of all this? Tell us about it.
Sure. Well, there have been comedy presidential candidates in the past. I think many people consider Donald Trump a comedy presidential candidate. But, the book is really about how you can draw a direct line from the gossip pages really to the heart now of political power because of the increased importance of publicity and celebrity and those kinds of arts that many people had for a long time considered very trivial. And to your point, we now have a pop culture figure in the White House. And I don't think anyone considers Kanye West, even by Donald Trump standards, a plausible candidate. But he's doing the groundwork to get on the ballots in various states. He's missed a couple of deadlines. He's still trying to get on South Carolina, I think, Oklahoma maybe. The fact that in 2020 we have if not plausible, at least in his mind, a very serious presidential competition between Kanye West and Donald Trump just shows how celebrity can be leveraged into political power. I make the argument in the book. The subtitle of the book is How I Help the Rich Become Famous and Ruin the World. And one of the subtexts of the book is how the rich used to eschew publicity in the 20th century. And around the turn of the century, the values shifted. And the rich realized they could leverage celebrity for more money, more status, and literal political power.
Yeah, and it became its own, when it was a liability, it became a currency.
Sure, yeah.
And so does it connect to sort of the end of discretion? Is there a role for discretion anymore, or is that just incredibly passe and technology won't allow for it?
Well, there were two major shifts in the last 20 years. One was cultural, and the other one was technological. Around the turn of the century, we had in the late 90s, we had a writer's strike in Hollywood, which encouraged the television studios to emphasize reality television, which didn't have a traditional writing staff. Became popular, as you know. And in the early aughts, young people were telling me that they were noticing that their friends' behavior was changing as they were beginning to ape these more performative styles of behavior that they saw on television, which were where these cast members would get more screen time. And then, of course, by the late aughts, 2010, we had social media, which exactly doubled down on these same kinds of behaviors, except now everyone was their own publisher, everyone was their own studio broadcaster. And all these behaviors were being absolutely reinforced and rewarded. And unfortunately, one of the points I make in the book is that if you're going to follow that sort of cultural and technological arc, one figure that you have to take seriously, and this is where I lose 70% of the audience all the time, is Paris Hilton. And I'm sorry, but I think she was a mastermind who took over the world because she had a grand plan. But the fact is, she was doing everything right. She was the pivotal figure in I believe, the change in values from discretion and shame in the 20th century to them being useless in the 21st century. And everything that the 17-year-olds are doing on TikTok today is stuff that she was doing when she was 17 in 1999 and dancing on tabletops.
Yeah, no, she really was OG. And what, what happened to her though? She didn't have, I mean, I know the Kardashians became popular after she was popular, but it seems like it seems like her shelf life has not been what you might expect. I mean, even Nicole Richie has more cultural relevance, and they, remember the show that they were on together?
Simple Life, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was, that's discussed in the book too. That was part of, there was an heiress trend at the time, that Paris popularized this notion that to be popular, you had to be wealthy, from this very wealthy background. And she performed being wealthy in a way that I thought was not like actually being wealthy. I argue in the book that she was actually appropriating the hip hop critique of wealth, because it was all the fur coats and the bling and the big sunglasses and the sports cars. And I would argue that the hip hop critique of that in the videos was about people who were traditionally excluded from luxury, people who were excluded from those signifiers of success. And she took it kind of literally and served it back at the public, but as a person from a legitimately wealthy background. And I do believe that the Kardashians and Donald Trump are her disciples in that regard. Trump, of course, was famous in the 80s already through his divorces, but I do believe that he picked up the tools that she was using to his great success, and Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, that's I hadn't thought about it that way, and it's a really, really excellent point. So what is all of this social media and, reality, everything, what has that done to gossip columns? I mean, what has it done to sort of ink stained, show up at the party people like you?
Well, I think the traditional gossip columns are pretty much irrelevant now. I mean, in the United States, there's just one standing, which is Page Six. Still does a really good job, probably not helped by the fact that it doesn't have any competition in the traditional sense. There's no real reason for Page Six to exist, because the New York Post, which publishes it, hasn't been profitable since Rupert Murdoch bought it in 1976. So as a business venture, it only survives because Murdoch finds it useful to subsidize it. TMZ, I think, is profitable. And does a sort of similar function, but it's not as arch as the traditional gossip columns in the New York sense were. And also, without getting too deep into it, there's a cultural difference between gossip on the West Coast and gossip on the East Coast. It really is a one company town. It's a studio system. It's all about that kind of segment of the culture. Whereas in New York, I think one of the reasons why the gossip columns could thrive is that if you pissed off one segment of the city, whether it's like, for example, the studio system, there's so much else to cover. The next night, there'd be a book launch. The night after that, there'd be a Broadway opening. Then there might be a fashion event or a finance event. So you could afford to piss people off because there was so much else going on. And that's not so much the case on the West Coast.
That's very interesting and very true. Having been sort of an editorial assistant in the 90s, going to whatever parties your boss wasn't going to. It was one night it was an art gallery, and one night it was fashion, a book party. Donald Trump and the gossip columns had a very symbiotic and mostly mutually beneficial relationship, it seems. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, he was never shy about calling the gossip columns. When he was getting started in the 80s, he would have a fake press agent, which was himself. And
you mean John Barron?
Yes.
John Barron isn't real?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you called him, you know, often his long-suffering secretary would patch you through to John Barron, who was. Later on, he dropped that and he called the columns himself. Traditionally, the New York Post backed him in the divorce, and the Daily News backed Ivana. So I was sort of more associated with the news. So I was on the anti-Donald side.
Okay.
He would often yell at me when I ran into him for things that I'd written in my column, which was kind of hilarious. Notably at Ivana's like fourth wedding at Mar-a-Lago. So I wish I'd remembered what he actually said, because if I'd known he was going to become president, I might have paid more attention. But it's just, you know,
yeah, a lot of people should have paid more attention, I think.
No, but he definitely. I mean, I talk about in the book how I think there was a synergy between the Trump family and the Hilton family, which I think especially to a foreigner, they seem very similar. I don't know if they seem that way to an American, but they're very kind of show-busy, flashy people, which illuminates some aspect of the American character, I felt. And, you know, Trump became very famous in the 80s for his divorces. Paris sort of won the 90s, and then Donald did the political coup, which outdid them all. But there was definitely like a stepping system there, and synergies between the way the two families utilized publicity for their benefits.
Mm-hmm. And Cindy Adams really played a role with Donald Trump also. I mean, she's as part of the New York Post, obviously, but they were and are close from what I gather. And she, I think, introduced him to Roy Cohn, which really shows, you know, how all these power, you know, brokers come together just over dinner parties in New York. It's really...
And then there was a former New York Daily News gossip writer, Marcus Barham, investigations found notes that was the switchboard operator in the Cohen organization had kept about who was calling. And there's a fascinating note where Donald calls Cohen to thank him for getting his sister Marion Trump Barry a federal judgeship. So like it's the corruption is all.
Wow. So if you get invited to a dinner, do you have like any go-to story, like your sort of like best story, or do you have any stories you dine out on, or is it all just too many good ones to have any favorites?
Well, it depends on the crowd. Younger crowd, I might talk about how I broke the Kim Kardashian sex tape.
Tell us about that. That's a good story.
So in those days, there were these sort of video companies which specialized in releasing famous people's sex tapes. And to be crystal clear, if you are marketing a famous person's sex tape in the traditional sort of VHS, you know, into your video recorder model, you have to get the permission of the people who are on it. You cannot, I'm sure some people have illegally released it, but if you're selling it in a store, it means the people who are in the tape have agreed to it.
Okay.
Gawker.com ran a snippet of a unauthorized Hulk Hogan sex tape, and literally shut them down. So, you know, Paris Hilton, when her tape came out, she was making money off it. She denied it. Ultimately she came clean. Same with Kim Kardashian and Ray J, the boyfriend who at the time was the more famous party. So how it worked in those days, the video company gets the tape. They call the gossip columns because they know that we will talk it up in our column and make it sound like super scandalous and salacious. Which raises the value of it. And then the company goes back to the participants and they say, well, look, we're getting all this publicity for the tape. We can offer you even more money. And indeed, both the parties ended up signing. So it was that was the way they raised the market value for it.
Wow. It's just, I mean, maybe I'm old that it's really, I mean, I guess if it's going to come out, why not, you know, be a party to the remuneration, but it just...
This was before there was widespread video on the internet. So, I mean, if she hadn't signed it on the dotted line, who knows? I mean, these days, I think there's no way you could keep something like that off the internet, but I'm also quite proud of the time that Harvey Weinstein called me to yell from his private jet.
So tell us.
Oh, he was just being a loudmouth at a New York party. And he was...
Wow. Harvey Weinstein?
Right. How he was fighting with Jeffrey, I presume Katzenberg, and I couched it, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't 100% sure it was Katzenberg, but it seemed to be him in the item. And it was big. You could literally just follow him with your little notebook, you know, writing down everything you said at a party. He never knew you were there. And so I
Mhm.
ran beside him, and he called me to yell from his jet. And his pilot made him hang up as he descended into LAX, and then they called me back from the ground to keep yelling. So I called him out immediately.
Wow. Well, so Harvey Weinstein really used the gossip columns in a lot of, ways to further his deception and predatory behavior. Tell us a bit about that.
So there was the Daily News was a sort of cleaner shop in how it prosecuted gossip. At the New York Post, and this is all public information, and certainly the news flashed it over this front page when the Post got in trouble for this. But the Post had more of a culture of accepting favors and literal cash, which is not actually illegal to send a journalist cash, surprisingly enough. And Richard Johnson, as was reported at the time, took $1,000 from a restaurateur to mention his restaurant. And beyond that, a lot of the journalists on Page Six were getting studio development deals for scripts or book deals for their Miramax book arm, and while they were covering Harvey Weinstein. And that wasn't necessarily a secret because the books were coming out by Miramax Books, but that was tolerated. At the Post in a way that wasn't so much at the News. I have to say I was never offered a Miramax book contract, so I was never in that position. George Rush, who was one of my mentors at the News, was given a pile of cash, which he returned. So I think that, but this was not just the gossip columns. Many big magazine editors, brand name magazine editors, were also at the time and maybe still getting studio development deals for magazines that covered the studios. So it was a layer of corruption which existed in newspapers and magazines at the time. And Harvey, Harvey or someone working on his behalf would also buy incriminating paparazzi pictures because he was out and about with girlfriends and they would sometimes be seen. So that was another way that he kept it out of the papers. And if you called and you weren't in his pocket, you didn't have a development deal or he hadn't bought the pictures, he would always give you some other juicy bit of information. And that was another way that he kept his misdeeds out of the papers.
Wow. And it worked for a very long time. And also, I mean, why, if we, I think a lot of people had some inkling that he was a bad guy. But I mean, I certainly had no idea the breadth of it, and maybe nobody or few people did. But why was it so hard to report? I mean, why did it take so long? I mean, even David Carr, the late great David Carr, was struggled to get something that could get into print. Is it that we are more willing to take on powerful people now, or can you address that at all?
Well, in Harvey's specific case, I think there were three factors. One is that he was so famous, and Miramax was the biggest deal in the world at the time in that world. So there was a real incentive to sort of suck up. Let's be honest. I mean, he had all the heat. So to be on Harvey's good side was where you wanted to be. And we didn't portray him positively. We portrayed him as a bully and a womanizer. But we called him a rapist, and which I think gets to the second point, that we didn't have anyone on the record to say that, Harvey raped me. And the New York Times and Ronan Farrow, working for the New Yorker, worked for many years to get the story to that place. I mean, it was difficult to do that. But also, thirdly, I think we have to admit to our sexism and misogyny culturally. Certainly, the tabloids, were not particularly woman-friendly and still aren't. And I would say that there was sort of always the background assumption that, oh, well, so-and-so actress was on the casting couch because she's a careerist. And there's that old trope that the women knew what they were doing and they were in charge of what they were doing, and not the reality, which is that they were raped. And I maybe we didn't do as good a job in seeing that as we should have done.
Well, and I think what you say is really true, because we just have a so much more nuanced understanding of consent and power dynamics, and that, agreeing to something under certain pressures is different than consenting to something. And maybe we needed as a culture to get to that place where we could accept that. And And so what do you think, what's going to happen with Harvey? I mean, not that you have, people always ask, people are always like, is Donald Trump going to win? Like, I have no idea. And now I'm doing that to you, but what, you do, I'm sure you do. Tell me what you think is happening or is going to happen with Harvey criminally.
Well, I think to some extent it has happened. I mean, certainly the eye of the media has moved on. I mean, I would never put it past him to, he's a wily old bugger, and he can afford the best lawyers. So, I don't honestly have an understanding of the legal structures that might spring him, or whether might spring him or whatever. I would suspect it would be unlikely that he will get out. I think that the judges do, especially in New York, take into account public opinion and interpret that as the public interest to some extent. So I would be very surprised if he got out. Even if he does, he's facing a similar charges in Los Angeles in a completely different jurisdiction. Yeah. So touch wood, I think that's one particular monster who might be put away for maybe not life, but for many years to come. But the attention's moved on. Now we're having the same conversation about Ghislaine Maxwell. I did a very similar conversation.
And what do we know about her? What do you know that the rest of us don't know?
Well,
who's the husband?
Oh, right. It's probably that weird tech guy who lives in Manchester by the Sea, right? We think.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense.
So there's a weird bookend in the book. The first celebrity I met in New York was Monica Lewinsky, and it was right after the impeachment drama, and she was in New York selling a handbag line, and I write about how I was blown away by that as a young Aussie who had sort of very 20th century views about proprietary, and what was tasteful. And I was surprised that she was flogging these handbags on the basis of her notoriety, and that she was embracing publicity in that way. And that was my first sense that New York worked differently than the places that I was familiar with. And the polar opposite of that happens at the end of the book, where I am offered an exclusive interview with Jeffrey Epstein, which was just a few months before he was rearrested. And he had some success in re-entering New York society. There was that dinner party that Peggy Siegel, with Prince Andrew there, Katie Couric was there, George Stephanopoulos was there. So there were all these people who were willing to be in his company. His line at the time was that he had served his time. Obviously, the charge that he served time on was ridiculously minimal because he had successfully corrupted the judiciary in Florida. Yeah. So it didn't represent his crimes at all. But the PR version was, I served my time. And because he still had the money, New York society was by and large willing to re-embrace him. And it was the heroic efforts of one journalist, really, Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald, who was the voice in the wilderness saying, you have to reconsider this. His real crimes are nothing like what he was convicted of. And ultimately, the feds did listen to her, which is why he was rearrested. But at the time, he was talking to various different New York City publicists with the full expectation that more publicity was going to be good for him, again, rather than hide from the limelight, that he could utilize the press, even the New York Times perhaps, as a way to re-legitimize himself and re-enter the corridors of power.
Plus giving money to MIT and Ohio State and any place that would accept it, really, which was many. So it's interesting because gossip historically has really kind of celebrated misbehavior. That was fun. It was juicy. It was fun to read about. And now we've moved into a very different time with cancel culture. Tell me what you think about cancel culture.
It's horrifying to an older person. I think it has something of the mob to it. And I think, probably traditional journalists, especially gossip journalists, are just kind of resentful that they no longer hold the power, really, that they're no longer the gatekeepers to that kind of culture. Because, gossip columns traditionally existed to mediate the celebrity experience with the fans. And ideally, if they were doing their jobs with integrity, to tell the truth when people were self-dealing or lying or misrepresenting themselves. That's the idealized version of a gossip columnist. And obviously, sometimes it wasn't that. But I do think that now that celebrities are like everyone else, self-publishers, although we can't trust them to tell the truth about themselves, a lot of the regular daily stuff like baby bumps and relationship announcements and cute pictures at the beach, they no longer need the mediation level that we used to provide.
Right.
Cancel culture, I don't know. I mean, I just, it's a little terrifying, not always unjust, but I'll let the kids work that out.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting also because though, celebrities don't need the media in the same way, but then they have less power over keeping things out of the media. There's when, there used to be a little bit of a give and take. I mean, I can't remember. I know that some story I did, and I've done too many and my brain is just gone. But there was somebody tried to, like, if you don't report this, I'll give you this instead. I mean, that would happen a lot, or not a lot, but it happened. And now I bet that happens less. Celebrities can't sort of barter like that because we have found a way to move on. I mean, the press has found a way to move on without them because they ditched us.
I mean, I think the biggest threat for celebrities is that everyone is a paparazzo now.
Yeah.
The pictures, which are probably more damning. I mean, you hear a rumor, you believe it or don't believe it. But I think it's the pictures which really can get them in trouble.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's talk a little bit about the book specifically. Tell me about the impetus to write it. Just you were ready to sort of reflect and pull it all together, or, tell us how it came to be.
I think so. I mean, specifically in 2017, 2018, my mother, who's in Australia, had a little bit of a health wobble. And she told me that she was ready to sell the house and move into care. And so I quit the job I had at the time here in New York City, and I went back to help her do that. And the first night back, she said, "I'm feeling a lot better. I've changed my mind." And I was like, "But Mom."
Moms, only a mom.
I quit my job in New York City where I live in order to come back and do this. So it's a total setup, but that was okay because, number one, I probably needed a break. And it was more time with her than I've been able to in the last 20 years. And I viewed it as book league. So honestly, it was my conniving mother who for 8 months. And I used that time to write the book.
She just wanted to know how much you loved her. She was testing you and you passed the test. And then she was like, all right, go back. And how long did it take?
I wrote the book on spec, which is typically not how this stuff is done. I would sell it on a proposal, but because I had this wonderful time and nothing else constructive that I could really do, I wrote the book and I came back. And I'm very grateful to Eamon Dolan, who had just joined Simon & Schuster at that time. It was the first manuscript he bought. This week he's in the news because he's also Mary Trump's editor. And
wow, you're in good company.
Other books set a Simon & Schuster sales record, 1 million copies in the first week. So So Smart used to say on Get Smart, missed it by that much. I'm glad he had it. It wasn't mine.
And did you write it in New York or back home?
Back home, mainly. Yeah.
And what did the distance help at all? The being literally on the other side of the world from this New York media machine, or no? Because Australia certainly has its. I mean, it's where Murdoch's from. So.
Oh no, it absolutely helped. I think looking at the ridiculous glitz of New York, and especially the kind of nonsense, frothy level layer in which I operated, it really was very beneficial to be somewhere very grounded, with the kookaburras singing out the window, and I think it did help to be a long way away from that.
And was there anything that you almost didn't include, or anything that you weren't sure about? Any anecdotes or themes or parts of the book that you really struggled or vacillated with?
Well, there are some things that didn't make the book because I thought they would be hurtful to people. So not everything went in. I would just say intellectually, treating Paris Hilton seriously was something that I very nearly didn't do because I just knew it would be a big turnoff to a lot of people. But I genuinely believe that she was a pivotal figure in the culture. in the book, I talk about, there was a particular article in the New York Times in 2005. It was called Paris Inc. And it took her seriously as a brand. And to me, I knew it was a little bit skeptical. It was the Times. It wasn't just a press release, but it talked about how she was a brand and not just this bimbo that many people thought she was. And to me, that was a real inflection point in sort of the roadmap of how that kind of thing is done. And I believe specifically that Kim Kardashian and Donald Trump took notice of that particular story and recalibrated accordingly. But it would have been really easy not to take Paris Hilton seriously because there is still so much animus towards her. And I think a lot of that is just misogyny. And so I really had to take a deep breath and say, sorry, guys, I believe that Paris Hilton is an important figure in the culture. And I do think that's very controversial, and a lot of people aren't prepared to.
Well, you know, as a journalist, you got to put in, you know, what feels right, and being counterintuitive, you know, can be very provocative in a good way. You said something that really made me think that there were things you left out because you didn't want to hurt people's feelings in certain cases. Is hurting people, do you have to inure yourself to hurting people's feelings when you are a gossip columnist?
To some extent, but not significantly more than you do, I think, or any other professional journalist. One in the
yeah.
I think that you just need a tough skin, and a lot of people get into gossip because they want to be friends with celebrities, which is the worst possible way to it's the worst possible motive for wanting to do it. And I think it's why there's such a lot of bad tech journalism. There's also a lot of very good tech journalism as well. But I think you see that right now with the heat in tech. A lot of journalists, you get the sense they want to be buddies with these founders. They've definitely like drunk the Kool-Aid. And so I think any kind of journalism, it's the same principles apply. That you have to not be doing it because you want your subjects to like you.
Yeah. And is there sort of a way to avoid being mean-spirited? I mean, I guess there's Gawker, part of what was both enticing and, you know, off-putting about Gawker was it could be funny, it could be snarky, and you're laughing at the person, not with them most often, but just then they would just sort of go that little bit too far, and it would make me uncomfortable, at least. I mean, how do you do that? Or is it hard to do?
It is hard to do, and it's you certainly there are several cases where you don't get it right. As I say in the book, when you're writing a daily print gossip column on a print deadline, the bus leaves every day at 6 p.m. and somebody has to be under it. So there were a couple of times that my lead fell out at 4 o'clock, and I had literally 2 hours to beat something up essentially, and to convince the readers of New York City that I had this big story the next day. And sometimes I think people did get bruised, and there were occasions that I didn't feel great about doing that, but I had to feed the beast, and that was the nature of the job. I mean,
have you ever gone back and apologized to anybody?
That's a good question. I probably should deal with that step of the program. I don't think I did anything too egregious. I will say that the biggest moral qualm I had with that period of gossip was how it treated the sort of Lindsay, Britney, Paris, triumvirate. Right. And particularly Britney, when she had a very public struggle with mental health, the tabloids, and my paper particularly, was salivating over it. And that's why the subtitle of the book is How I Help the Rich Become Famous and Ruin the World, because I don't want to point the finger and say, oh, you terrible celebrity, look at what you're doing. The media was really, and my part of the media was very complicit in beating all that up. And when Britney was having her breakdown, it was totally being fueled by us and our gaze. And what she needed really was to be left alone. And we were not giving her that option because her breakdown was selling papers. And I was very nervous that we were on the cusp of a Princess Diana moment where we were going to literally hound her to death. And I'm glad that didn't happen. But that certainly was a big moral qualm I had about what we were doing at the time.
And they're also, I mean, I would exclude Paris from this, but with Britney and Lindsay, it feels like their parents played a role in propelling them to the spotlight. I mean, it's really complicated. And I think a lot of people want that they want press, they just want the press that they want, and then they want it to go away. And it's, you can't, you're sort of all in or not. Then,
well, I think one of the challenges these people face is that they are the economic engine of their entire, universe, or the people in their orbit who should be giving them advice in their interests are always economically dependent upon them doing what they do. So that's why you very rarely get people saying maybe take a step back, maybe take a year off, because there's money at stake, and they get that caring advice often.
Yeah. Wow. So I think we've got some people who want to ask questions, and I'd love to give them I need my glasses because I'm old and I can't see anymore. All right. We have a former Obama White House staffer with us. Hello, welcome. What's your favorite story from the Obama years? His name is like he wore a tan suit. Yeah.
The Obama years seem tame, bordering on forgettable, based on our current incumbent. I think Bo, the Portuguese water dog. I mean, that's the story that I come back to. I mean, it was just such a feel-good story.
Remind us.
So if I remember, the kids were allergic to dogs, and I'm sure we will be corrected by the Obama era staffer if I get it wrong. But I remember the kids needed a hypoallergenic dog, and they found that the Portuguese water dogs fit that criterion, and they got Bo, who was the biggest star, to come along in White House pets since like FDR's dog. So that's the story I remember. Oh, actually, one other story. I did. Perez Hilton ran a picture of one of the daughters. I remember once on his website, and I got a call from a staffer in the White House, maybe the same one, wanting Perez's phone number because, of course, they wanted him to take the picture down immediately. She did do, and I remember being quite happy that if anyone in the world can connect the White House with Perez Hilton.
It's your whole TMZ New York Times thing. You're like, right, you're you got a problem, you're the guy.
Hello, I'm your guy.
Okay, good. All right, so add your questions to the little Q&A guy, the little, you know what I'm talking about. Add your questions there. Okay. Okay, so from are we saying names? I don't know if we say names. So recently I've been noticing that the way in which celebrities must be willing to inflict injury upon themselves for the sake of gaining publicity. Has this always been the case? If not, when did things change and how? So I guess I'm not sure if we're talking about literal injury or just sort of behaving in a self-destructive way, but has negative attention been something that celebrities have historically relied on, or is that sort of in the era where we are also distracted, they're looking for some way to get our attention?
Sure. I mean, I think manufactured drama has been a mainstay of gaining attention since the invention of the modern gossip press, which followed on the heels of the studio system. Manufactured relationships, manufactured breakups, the performative arguments that we saw on reality television that then were reproduced on social media. And I think that's where cancel culture plays in, that people are constantly upping the ante. And I think one of the reasons why our culture is so fraught at the moment is that all writers from Homer to Shakespeare to gossip columnists have understood that drama is what sells. And that, our patience for reading about a happy family is only so much, but if there's something, at stake and some family falling apart, we want to read about that. Now that every individual in what we've come to call the attention economy understands that essential, the value of that transaction, everyone is reproducing it. So I agree with you. If you define injury as self-destructive behavior, I think that people realize that gets the eyeballs, and that's why they're doing it.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna scroll down. Oh, I think we can say Demetra is here because she says hi to both of us. Hi, Demetra. Okay, the other thing social media has done is enable famous people to try to control the story. So coming out ahead of any stories by announcing conscious uncoupling. Army and Elizabeth Chambers are the most recent example, but it feels like they're trying to convince fans that they're taking part in the gossip, right?
Right. Well, I mean, conscious uncoupling is a great example. I mean, that took everyone by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that was a particularly good way to finesse, the breakup of Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin, who popularized the expression. And I want to stress that I don't think that was artifice necessarily. I mean, they're very, Gwyneth has a very mindful manner and way of doing things. So maybe that was 100% legitimate, and that's how they view it. But it was just perfection from a public relations point of view, because it really took the teeth out of the story, and I think it made it harder for journalists to make trouble in that space. They were emphasizing the positivity. At the end of the day, people will lie in their own self-interest, and I think that's why there will always be a role for journalism, whether it's relatively trivial about famous people's relationships or much more important things like the resident of the White House. Yeah, I do think that social media has reduced our role dramatically.
Okay. During your fashion journalism years, did you ever make any poor personal fashion choices? Were you ever a glamour fashion don't, Ben?
More often than not, I would say.
Okay.
So I was the least fashionable person in our little clique, which included Horatio Silva and Lee Carter, who was the publisher of Hint magazine. They got fashion very naturally, and I didn't. And also, the only place I could afford to shop was Century 21. So, I mean, who hasn't been to Century and been tempted to buy the thing that maybe was for a more glamorous person than yourself? There was a particular Vivienne Westwood shirt, which was it's one of the shirts that needed to come with instructions on how to wear it. And I finally found out after many occasions of wearing it wrongly that it had a hood that was sort of one piece. It wasn't an obvious hood, but the shirt only made sense if you wore this sort of cowl on top of it, which brought it all up, which I would wear, and I just looked like Queen Noor, with sort of.
You did? You wore it?
And so that was a big fashion turn.
Okay. All right, Ben, I feel smarter and cooler for this discussion. Sociologically, this is extremely interesting and explanatory. Great work, my friend. From Heather. So you can thank Heather. I feel smarter too. Okay. Can you share one juicy anecdote that's not in the book? Too hot for Simon and Schuster. What couldn't you get in? Tell us.
Oh God. I would say that is the number one most common question I get asked. My response to that was I was a working gossip columnist for much of the time this book recounts. So it wasn't like something great would happen and I'd be like, I'm going to save that for the memoir in 20 years. It was my job. So I apologize for the super lame answer, but I kind of had to scrape the barrel for things we put in the book that weren't written at the time. I mean, Jerry Lewis claimed to me in an interview that he helped John F. Kennedy Jr. write Profiles in Courage, for which Kennedy won the Pulitzer Prize. Wow. That's not a blockbuster story, but that's one of the stories that was too nutty to use at the time, but is in the book. So I apologize. There's nothing more. What do you want from me?
I have a question of my own. What is the deal with Ben Affleck and the beautiful woman from Knives Out is with him? Like, how does he keep landing these people? And what are they like? I don't get it. Tell me, give me some insight into this.
I think that he is kind of a big wounded bird that people think, I think he attracts people who feel that they can make him whole and they can heal him. And I think he invariably hurts those women. But I just think he's a big sort of lovable bear. And I think that people are drawn to him because they feel they can help. And then he sort of sucks the life out of them and moves on to the next one.
Okay, well, wow, well. That's a good pithy answer. Can we define cancel culture, perhaps with a specific example? And this person has asked, Nick Cannon, like was Nick Cannon, and it's interesting. I'd love to have you define cancel culture and what it means to be canceled. Because sometimes I wonder if like canceling means it's unfair, but some people are, justifiably canceled. But why don't we explain the term and why don't you give a good example of it?
So at its base level, cancel culture is an online movement where there's a critical mass of people who agree that there's an individual who has done something so egregious that they should be deplatformed. That there are no circumstances under which it is permissible to like this person's cultural output because they've usually said this offensive thing, and now they should be removed from the public square. So in that regard, it's a very democratic movement. Like most of what happens online, it's very unnuanced. I think very few of us could survive that kind of examination, because also there's a thing about American culture particularly. Americans like to see people as good or bad. And there isn't this sense that we're all mixes of both, and that we're going to have good days and bad days. And maybe if we have an affair, I mean, like the French will accept that their president can have an affair and it doesn't make him a bad politician. Maybe the Americans accept now with Trump, but that traditionally wasn't what the Americans thought of. So cancel culture is an expression of this American black and whiteism, I think, that if you mess up, then you have to be eliminated. I will say, as a slightly older person, this is not my area of expertise. And your colleague Taylor Lorenz, writes brilliantly about it every week. But it is something that, to tie it back into the book, I was on a panel after I'd finished the gossip column, and I had a question from the audience because I was, doing my defending gossip shtick and saying how it's possible to do it ethically. And a woman in the audience said, "Isn't everyone entitled to a bad day?" And she said, the problem with gossip is that it fixes your subjects in the public consciousness at their worst possible moment. And that to her, that didn't seem fair. And I have to say, for all my, smooth answers as to why it's okay to be a gossip and the good it can do, I've never had an answer to that. And I think that she nailed a problem with gossip culture, is that, none of us would want to be known only for our worst day. And so maybe that is I think, so the modern equivalent of that is perhaps cancel culture.
Yeah. And also but one distinction I would make is that with traditional gossip coming out of the, more old-fashioned celebrity model, is that people are first elevated and celebrated before they get knocked down by gossip. So we may be sort of calling them out on their worst day, but only after we have sort of elevated them and venerated them. But with cancel culture, you can just be a regular person who's never enjoyed the perks of celebrity fame, money, and you still get, taken down a peg or many pegs, or as you said, deplatformed.
That's true. I mean, the occasional errant tweet can get people every day on Twitter. Someone who doesn't deserve it is getting deplatformed. And of course, no one ever bothers to read the original text of what this person is said to have done wrong. It's all about piling on to the group.
All right. So, well, this, I'm not sure, I'm not sure what to do with that. But this says, if Biden gets elected and Epstein stays in jail, will we see the beginning of the end of celebrity? But I believe Epstein, from what I've heard, is dead. I know there's some discrepancies about that, but I don't think he's in jail. So let's move on to the next one. What about closeted celebrities? Is that has been sort of people who are in the closet with their sexual orientation. They have gotten some sort of protection. Other than when they've been outed. But what is the dance with that, and what is the sort of ethos and philosophies guiding that?
Well, that's a great question. In the all through the 90s, my background was in LGBT media. We didn't call it LGBT. I'm so old, we called it gay media at the time.
Yeah.
So I worked for the gay paper in London, the Pink Paper, and then the gay paper in Sydney, which was the Sydney Star Observer. I wrote for The Advocate and Australian gay magazines. And outing was a big topic of the 90s, and especially obviously in our sector. And I came to the conclusion that your sexuality was a fact about you as important or non-important as your gender, as your hair color, as what you did for a living, as to whether you were or weren't married. And my opinion was it is a banal fact like that. And by treating it as something different, we were playing into homophobia. And I had this argument every week at the Daily News because I was, and essentially that means pro-outing, if you like.
Yeah.
Kind of controversial. A lot of people think that's disrespectful to the individual, which I can see. I don't necessarily even disagree with it. But after many back and forths with the Daily News lawyer, she couldn't ever actually show me a precedent in New York law that calling someone gay when they weren't, which was the fear, was defamatory. And to me, that was what was the problem, that to be identified as gay is defamatory, was the obnoxious part.
Right.
So I'm more in favor of identifying a person's sexuality factually. I completely understand that in many professions still, namely acting, if you are identified as a homosexual, male or female, or trans or bisexual, that can impact your earning ability. And if I were in that position, I understand why my attitude would be, it's no one's business and don't you dare tell that story. As a journalist, I felt like it was important that we demystify or de-demonize the notion of being LGBT.
Okay, interesting. All right, so let's go with one last question. I'm just sort of picking at, hi, Jamie Wolf. Okay. I think we talked to Aaron, someone brought up Aaron Schock, but I feel like we've talked about outing a little bit. How's your love life? And what questions do you find are effective in getting celebs to discuss their own?
Well, I will say that the way I did gossip, I was always in a press-friendly environment. Like I was never like running up to a celebrity on the street and initiating a conversation. I was always in a place where they were expecting to speak to journalists. So I mean, I tended not to ask about their love life in that regard, because talk about a way to turn off your subject. So yeah, I wouldn't, I mean, don't get me wrong, I would love a piece of information about it, which I could follow up. I mean, a great example is I was at, I think, Bungalow 8 one night, back in the day when Bungalow 8 was the place to be. And there was a young actress who wanted to plug for her project. She wasn't famous, but she was trying to be. And she traded information. Indeed, I gave her a plug for the project. And she was friends with Ethan Hawke. And this was a little bit after he'd split with Uma Thurman. And she said to me, well, you know he's with the nanny, right? And I was like, oh, I do not know he's with the nanny. But that was in the paper the next day.
Well, that's...
But you know, you would get that information through the back door. I would never say to Kate Winslet, tell me about your love life.
Right. Okay. That is, I mean, yeah, I guess it is the sort of thing you confirm. You don't ask, or not, but you don't ask it affirmatively. Okay. We're gonna go with one last thing. Okay. Ben, I used to read your syndicated column in my local newspaper in Massachusetts. How did you go from being a New York City gossip to being read across the USA?
Well, I will go ahead and say that I'm completely mystified that paper in Massachusetts ran the column, because I never got any syndication. I have heard that it was, I think, Gardner, Mass, if I'm correct. I never understood how that column ran on that newspaper, because I was never paid for it. But you know, to answer what the person's asking, I just think being in New York City, one of the things I notice, I have a family in England, I have family in Australia, and so often when I travel with them, the things they are talking about in those remote kitchen tables are exactly the same things we're talking about here in New York City, because I think the appeal for what brings so many of us here is that in New York City, local news is national and international news. You do meet Donald Trump. You know, you do meet the Clintons. You do meet Murdoch in the course of your reporting. And I think that's why New York is such a center that what happens here is interesting pretty much to everyone often.
I think that's a good point. Well, this has been so great. We should do this every night, Ben. And your book is wonderful. I think everybody should buy it. If you have not bought it and read it, you really, really must. And I just think you bring such humor and broad understanding and warmth to this topic. And I just think you're terrific, and the book is great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for coming. And, that's what we got for tonight.
Katie, thank you so much. I mean, I'm a little bit defensive about gossip because people treat it as just the worst trivial thing. So the book is more fun than maybe I was being tonight. Katie, thank you for your time. I want to thank Powerhouse and Chris for helping put this together. I want to thank Eamon Dolan at Simon & Schuster and Zipporah and Christine Kallela and everyone who's helped me there. And I want to end on one note. I received a text while we're talking about someone who's on the Zoom who's in the same world as this. And the text says, "Big penis equals Affleck, J-Lo's person told me." So there you go.
That's good. I mean, that was worth the price of admission for sure.
Thank you so much.
Very, very illuminating talk. Learning something every minute here. Thank you so much. Thank you to Katie. Thank you to Ben. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And if you missed any of the event, it'll be on YouTube soon. And please buy the book. We have the link in the chat and on the event page. It helps us put on more free events and helps out indie bookstores. So thank you.
Thank you. Good night.